Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I'm Caitlin. I'm part of TTA's communications firm. I'll be moderating today's webinar, and this webinar is brought to you by the Transportation Alliance, of course, by way of a grant from Mass Development. A few housekeeping items before we get started. All participants are muted. If you'd like to ask a question, you have the option to utilize the chat feature at the bottom of the menu bar. All of those messages will go directly to me throughout the webinar, and I'll relay all of them during the Q&A section of our program. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and the video will be uploaded and circulated at a later date. So let's kick off the webinar with our transportation consultant and TTA member, Jeb Corey, who will teach you all about how he found success by diversifying his fleet. So I'll kick it to you, Jeb.
All right, thanks, Caitlin.
Yeah.
Hold on just a second. I'll get my screen going here. All right. Caitlin, can you see the presentation there?
I can. Yeah, looks good.
Fantastic. All right, so the title of today's webinar is Corporate Accounts and NEMT Diversification. And this is kind of an operational deep dive. So if you were lucky enough to listen to Joe Rubino's webinar, he kind of gave you a higher level about, some ways to get into some of these type of work, especially on the NEMT side. So we're going to dig into it a little bit more from almost like an operational standpoint. So a little bit about myself. I've been in the transportation company or the industry now for about 20 years. My family's had the company for going on 40 years at this point. We run a small fleet of vehicles, about 25 to 30 in Charleston, West Virginia. So I consider, even though Charleston is the capital of West Virginia, I still consider it relatively rural. Small city of about 50,000 people and about 200,000 people in our county. With those vehicles that we have, we really do a lot with them, and we always kind of have. We do the traditional taxi business, we do corporate accounts, we do a lot of crew transportation, which is like railroad crews, barge crews, airline crews, some non-emergency medical transportation. And then we do a bit of ride share, really into the effect that some Uber and Lyft drivers actually lease our vehicles, and they do Uber and Lyft work and our work as well out of the same vehicles. And then we've always been pretty large on technology, or at least I have. When I kind of got involved, I really pushed the edge of technology with our companies. So one of the things that we want to talk about is using current resources. So most fleet operations generally have, some type of office staff, garage or shop staff. You have vehicles on hand, obviously some drivers, and then some technology. Now, depending on the size of your fleet, this can really vary, right? So if you're just running 1 or 2 cars versus 20 to 30 cars versus 100 to thousands of cars, these departments obviously vary by size. But for the most part, you generally have these types of things going on. So obviously we want to maximize them as much as possible. So when we look at the office staff, usually this is your dispatch office, and you're at the very basic level, you're call taking, you're in dispatching. Administrative, you're doing a little bit of cashiering. If you're doing account work or not doing account work, you will be doing invoicing, billing, accounts receivable, driver services, and those types of things. So really, if you're on the smaller side, if your operation is super small, some of these things you may not really even have yet, or if you do, it's very minimal. So dispatch an office right there. Really, as you move through this and you start adding more work, you really want it to be more of a customer service center, because you're really starting to do trips that take a little bit more detail or a little bit more information. So on the basic level, even us at 25 to 30 cars, there are times when we really only have one person in the dispatch office. And back when I got involved, we really just took the passenger's name, the phone number, the pickup address. That was really about it. And then you would handle some general questions, right? Like the status of the trip or vehicle issues, or somebody would call and just say, hey, are you open, these hours, or do you go to these places? And so smaller fleets on a basic level, that's pretty much, what we did, and I assume many others are doing. So as you start moving into this other work, some things that you really want to consider are how that work is really going to affect these different offices. And again, with your dispatch center, I've tried to stop calling it a dispatch office or a call center office. I try to call it our customer service center. And we have found that during busier times, you're going to want multiple people in that office, especially when you start doing a lot more of these NEMT works. We do not a ton, but roughly about anywhere between 100 to 150 NEMT trips a day. And again, it's very different than regular dispatch trips and things of that nature. These trips require a lot more information, a lot more time. So, you're definitely getting the pickup address, you're getting the destination address. Sometimes there's a lot more details. And we have found that sometimes when you're dealing with different organizations or different facilities, they may not even know all the details. So, especially with some medical facilities or hospitals, you might be taking a passenger to a huge medical complex. And sometimes the passenger doesn't exactly know what door they're going into, and sometimes the facilities don't know. So you're doing a lot of communication between a passenger, a facility, and a broker to make sure you have all the details in order, so that when you drop that passenger off or take that passenger into the door, they're in the right part of that medical facility. Otherwise, you can end up spending tons of time trying to figure out where that person needs to go, or you're on the wrong side of the building. And so you want to reduce that type of issue as fast as you can. And so when you're doing some of these trips, you want to take the proper amount of time to make sure you get the details right. A lot of transportation companies, especially small taxi operations, are pretty much focused on demand. So you may not be used to actually taking a reservation date and time. And with a lot of corporate work or NEMT work, you're doing a lot of that. A ton of this work is actually reserved in the future for a specific date and a specific time. And that can be a little tricky too, because there's a lot of variables that you may not know what's going on a week or so into the future. So, and that could be drivers, the amount of drivers on the road, that can be weather patterns, that could be other business coming in. So again, you're going to take a lot of time to make sure you get this information accurately in order, so you could prepare and create, manifest potentially for a driver. So you have the ability to really set up several trips in a row for a driver. You want to make sure you get the dates, the times, and all that stuff accurately, and that you've got drivers to fulfill those trips. Again, you're going to be doing a ton of communication between a passenger and the account holder or broker and a facility. So you got a lot of back and forth communication that you really need to get right. And there's sometimes too where you're on hold for a long period of time. So when you're working with a broker of sorts, this is usually our scenario, and something doesn't go right, the passenger doesn't want to go, or the passenger is a no-show, it's not just like a normal trip where the vehicle just goes on. You generally have to get with the broker, the account holder, and say, hey, this passenger is not showing up. And so their lines can be tied up for a certain period of time, or they could have you on hold for a certain period of time, or there could be wrong information. So you really, to get through some of these issues that now start happening can take up a lot of time. So if you're used to a call center with just kind of one person in there and a lot of information is fast and quick, and you're thinking about getting into more corporate work and more NEMT work, you really want to take into account that there's a lot more detailed information, and it's going to take a lot more time to get it right. And so it's helpful to have multiple people handling this type of call request and work. So to keep all that stuff straight, it really does help to have some of these newer state-of-the-art dispatch systems, because you are keeping all kinds of different pieces of information now. It's not generally just the person's name, pickup address, and phone number, but if you have to know what broker they're associated with. You have to know if it's a different account that's going on. You have dates and times that you're paying attention to. It may require a special vehicle, right? Like a wheelchair accessible vehicle. It may be a certain person who needs to be picked up at a certain time at a certain side of the house. So to try to keep all this track on pen and paper becomes very difficult. So you really want to make sure you have some good technology on hand to keep track of all the different details, so you can pull all that information up. You know exactly who's going on what day, what car they're going to be in, who's the driver, and then all that provides real-time information too. Most technology vendors these days have cloud-based models with tons of functionality. So I know At times, especially for smaller operators, this can be a challenge, right? Getting into some big technology because it can be complicated to install. It can be complicated to figure out. And these days, as most of you know, a lot of these things are now hosted in the cloud. So you don't necessarily need to have your own server. You don't need to have an IT person on hand. You don't necessarily need to have an IT team that's going to come in and take care of all this expensive hardware. These people host it in the cloud, or these companies now host it in the cloud, and it does make it a lot easier to get into this type of thing. So if you already have some of this technology in place, these are some things that you might want to look at. And if you have not ever gotten any of this technology in place, these are some key points that have become pretty much standard, but also very important. Obviously, you need GPS in one way or another. I feel like every piece of equipment we have in the vehicle these days has GPS. The cameras have GPS. The maintenance platform may have GPS. The dispatching system has GPS. And a lot of times the dispatching systems rely on driver applications that you can put on an iPhone or an Android phone now. Most of those phones have GPS. So that's a pretty common thing. Driver apps and passenger apps have also become pretty common. And obviously, those are just the applications that keep the driver passenger in tune with the dispatch system. Web reservations are pretty important too. So you're going to want to have something on your website that allows for web reservations. So people can just go to the website, put in the information to be picked up. Now, there's a couple levels of that, right? So you have your basic web reservation where somebody like myself will go to a website and just say, hey, I need a ride. But then you have more detailed things like corporate portals. And corporate portals have over the last few years have become highly important and very useful because these are portals that you can allow your account holders or NEMT brokers or whoever you're doing business with. Basically, it's a more detailed portal into your dispatch system. So instead of them maybe calling into your call center or customer service center, they can log into the corporate portal and get the information they need. They maybe even it allows them to keep track of the trips, so they're up to date on what the trip status is and things of that nature. Open APIs, a lot of the new modern systems have this, but those APIs allow one computer system to basically communicate with other computer systems or software systems. And so that's actually extremely important these days because there is really no one ship solution. You're working with different ships and they all have to be able to communicate with each other. And having a very open API platform really allows that to happen. It can be super helpful into adding little modules if your main platform doesn't have what you need. Telephony has become actually a pretty important thing these days. So it used to be, you had your dispatch system and your phone system. They were completely separate. Maybe your dispatch system pulled caller ID information, but what you're seeing now is telephony or telephone systems that are almost either completely integrated into your dispatch platform or actually a module of your dispatch platform. And that can allow a lot of great information too. So you could have like automated call outs where the phone system the night before can call everybody who wants to be called, or they can send a text message, or it can email the person, to let them know, hey, this is a reminder your trip is coming up, or if you're not going to be ready for your trip, cancel now. And they can press a button on the phone to cancel. They can reply to a text message to cancel. And so again, you're kind of automating a lot of these things that take up sometimes a lot of people power. Ability to import trips into your dispatch system is very helpful too. There's lots of ways that can be done. At a very basic level, almost all systems allow some type of just import from like an Excel spreadsheet. So if you're working with a corporate account or an NEMT broker and they've got 150 trips for you to do, you don't want to sit there and type 150 trips into your dispatch platform because A, it's time consuming, and B, that could allow for some mistakes to happen. So if you can just import that, usually from the broker or account holder, into your dispatch system, that eliminates a lot of time consumption and eliminates the possibility of mistakes. Open APIs can actually do that too, almost in more of a real-time scenario. So if you're when you import a set of trips, like 150 trips, some of those could get canceled, or maybe they need to add trips to it. If you have an open API between your dispatch platform and the account holder or broker, it may be able to communicate that information in real time. So if somebody calls the broker and says, hey, I need to cancel a trip, broker cancels it on it end, and it sends an API notification to your platform to cancel it as well. And again, that stops having somebody to call into you and say, hey, this trip is canceled, and speeds things up a lot. Push notifications, SMS, and email. We talked a little bit about that already. Those are just other ways you can keep in touch with the passengers or the account holder or broker. Most of these platforms these days really allow you to use off-the-shelf technology, a phone or a tablet. We use tablets in all the vehicles. They're permanently mounted, kind of in the center of the vehicle and a little bit up on the dashboard. And this allows the driver to kind of work it for the most part of just really quick taps on the tablet. And also it keeps their eyes kind of centered in the vehicle and allows their peripheral vision to kind of keep track of what's going on the road. We didn't want drivers necessarily using their own cell phones if they're going to keep them in their lap and look down or keep them off to the side. We wanted to keep distractions as less as possible, so we kind of permanently mount them in the center of the dash. And then you've got all kinds of other voice capabilities can be a huge help. A lot of people, back in the late 80s, early 90s, even the early O's, you had a lot of radio communication between your dispatch center and the drivers. And as we've seen more and more of these data systems or dispatch systems that really just communicate by app, that's decreased a little bit. But we still have our dispatch platform, and then there's some other platforms out there that still allows voice communication between the driver and the dispatch center. And again, that can be done through the integrated telephony system, or it can be done with just over the cell phone, like a push to talk thing. And that can be a huge help because there's just some situations that get a little bit complicated and it's hard to text back and forth between the dispatch system and the driver, or if you don't want to tie up necessarily a phone line in your call center, and then having basically the equivalent of an old school radio communication on a new digital network can really help. And again, these new platforms kind of automate a lot of this stuff, right? So we're talking about a lot of moving parts, and the dispatch systems know where vehicles are via GPS. It knows where the passengers are via mapping systems. It knows where they're going. So it knows all these different variables and can help automate all these things. It can help know when to send these trips out. It knows, when a driver is near a location. It can help send a notification when a driver is near a location, letting the passenger know, hey, your vehicle is close by. And so the more you can kind of connect all these things and automate them, then the more efficient you can kind of become, again, with resources hopefully you're already using. Another key thing to kind of look at is modules for cashiering, billing, invoicing, and trip scheduling. So as you get more into corporate work, you're going to have to do a lot more of those types of things. And if you're doing them on pen and paper and hand, that can become time consuming. But if your platform that connects all this stuff has these modules, then that can help speed up those processes some as well. So kind of leading into that, so your administrative staff, for us, this was one of the more critical things that we had to stay on top of. If you're not really ready for something like this, it can really become overwhelming because, again, if you're dealing with a corporate account or an NEMT broker that you're doing hundreds of trips, those trips have to be documented properly. They have to be in the proper order so they can get processed in a timely fashion. And you may be doing this differently for different brokers or different account holders. They may have different things that they want on them, or they might want a different format. And so sometimes that can become very challenging. So it helps when you're starting off small. If you're just adding a couple accounts here or a couple account holders and they're only doing a few trips a week or a few trips a month, then it's really not such a big deal. But when you start getting into lots of these trips per day, it can become extremely overwhelming. Your basic admin staff, you probably handled by yourself, or maybe you just had one person helping out with that and they were doing lots of other duties, especially if you were a smaller company. Larger companies, obviously have teams of people to do this, but if you're really small, again, this is something you're probably doing yourself. Usually this is just collecting a lease payment for vehicles, or maybe handling payroll or taking care of complaints and things like that. But again, as you start getting into more of this type of work and you have to process more paper vouchers, or even if they're electronic, to make sure all that information is correct, you're probably going to want to grow that staff out a little bit. You're going to want 1 to 2 people kind of handling cashiering invoicing, billing, and accounts receivable. Especially because, again, keep in mind, these people are going to want to go on vacation, or you're going to want to go on vacation. So to make sure that you can cover this time periods when people are off, sick, or on vacation, maybe you're going to want a little bit of redundancy there. And depending on your regulatory environment too, you may be able to negotiate different prices with your corporate accounts and NEMT brokers. A lot of taxi systems historically have had tight regulations on what their fares could be, or maybe what your limo fare could be. As time's moved on, and obviously as the ride-sharing market has expanded, we're seeing a little bit of break away from that. Our traditional companies are getting a little bit more flexibility, or maybe your regulators allow you to determine your price with a corporate account or an NEMT broker anyway. So you may now be getting into a scenario where you're dealing with multiple entities and you're doing work for multiple entities, and you're doing it for a different price. And so that's another level of complication that you kind of have to stay on top of. And you want to know what you can do things for what price too. So there's a lot of organizations out there who will come to you and they want you to do work, and they're going to try to obviously squeeze every penny out of you. And you've got to kind of determine at that point in time too, to make sure that price that they want you to do it for is realistic or feasible. If it's not, don't do it, or try to negotiate a higher price, or try to come up with maybe some other scenarios. Maybe you want less volume for a higher price. What you do not want to do, and I have seen other providers do, is just try to get as much volume as they possibly can. They're willing to do it for the lowest price possible out there. And that price doesn't cover the cost of work. And if the price of doing this work doesn't cover the cost of it, obviously you're not in a good business position, and it's not going to help you at all. So you got to make sure you really pay attention to what these prices are that some of these organizations want you to do the work for. Cashiering, like I said, comes a little bit more complex for drivers and staff, especially if you're dealing with different rates and processing rates. So, from a small taxi perspective, it used to be relatively easy to cashier a driver. They owed you some type of lease fee, and there may be a couple other little fees involved, and they might come in daily or weekly, and you kind of settle things up. But when you start dealing with lots of different corporate accounts, and you may have, again, multiple rates, and you may want to charge different processing fees for some of these rates as well. So we have some stuff that we charge, just 5% to. If it's an account that's relatively easy and it doesn't take a lot of work on our end to process that work or stay on top of it, we may only charge 5% to process that for a driver. Some of the more complicated work that takes up a lot more time and puts you a lot more risk, especially cash flow risk. If you're doing $10, $20, $30, $40, $50,000 a week for some of these entities, obviously, if you don't do it right and in a timely fashion, you could really put yourself into a cash flow problem. So those trips, we charge a higher rate to process that work for drivers. And again, some of these different organizations, they have a specific invoice, or they have their own billing portal. Sometimes you have to do that too. So if you're working with different people, you may have to go into one billing portal for that organization and a different billing portal for another organization. You have to learn these portals, how they like information, and how they like that stuff transmitted to them, because you're going to keep this flowing as fastly and quickly as possible. And so sometimes, again, if you're doing a few of these trips, you can handle it on your own. But if you're small and building up, you're going to want more office staff to stay on top of this. And we've talked a little bit about the technology stuff as well. So the same thing with the, your dispatch platform, the technology that you utilize here to handle some of this office stuff. You want to make sure it has the modules or APIs for all these different integrations, and that's going to help out a ton. A lot of times these platforms, you can set up the corporate account holders in there, and you can say, okay, and rates can become complicated too, right? So it's not just a rate per mile anymore. Sometimes it's like between 0 and 3 miles, we're going to give you a flat rate of $5, and between 3 and 7, we're going to give you a flat rate of $10, and between 7 and 10, we give you a flat rate of $15. Anything beyond 10 is $2 a mile or $1.50 a mile. But if you use wheelchair accessible vehicle, all those rates change. Or if you have to travel a far distance to take somebody a short distance, you may need to bill for unloaded mileage. So now you start running into all these these complications of keeping all these different rates right and in order. So you want to make sure you have a technology platform that can help do that. And a lot of them these days can. There's also, yeah, there's some things you can do that really export out into customized invoices and integrate directly into billing portals. So that's a lot of things that we're really looking at now. So if somebody wants something in a specific layout, as long as all that information is in your dispatch platform or your technology platform, presenting it to somebody in a different format is really not so hard. You have to put a little time into creating what that's going to look like, but it can be done. And with APIs now too, sometimes you can just communicate directly between your dispatch or technology platform through an API directly into the portal, so you won't have to do so much entry. As much as you can automate and reduce any type of double or triple entry, obviously it's going to save you a lot of time, money, and energy. One of the things that we did too early on is we had a high-end document scanner. So, we're transitioning a lot more from this paper to just having things electronic and done automatically. But before that, we had one account where they wanted us to use their paper manifests, and we would have 150 of those paper manifests a day, or even more sometimes. And we'd have to run those through a document scanner and send them to them. So those little multifunctional printers that you pick up at Office Max really aren't going to do the deal. You're going to want a nice high end, usually spending somewhere around between $500 and $1,000 to really handle that kind of work. But again, that can cut out a lot of time and energy if you can just scan them in pretty quickly. So, and one of the other things you want to take a look at is your fleet. And if you already have a fleet of 5, 10, 15, 20 vehicles, you probably already have a mechanic and some equipment on hand to maintain your fleet. And most of the time you can do a lot of this work with your fleet that you already have. We were primarily basic sedans, but however, there's going to be times where there's other vehicles that may be needed. Maybe some corporate accounts want a little bit of a nicer car, or some of our corporate accounts, because we're in rural West Virginia, we're out in railroad tracks and out in the middle of nowhere, they require SUVs for us to use. Some of your non-emergency medical work and some of the more profitable non-emergency medical work is actually done with wheelchair accessible vehicles. So while you can do a lot of this with your current fleet, these are some other types of vehicles that you may want to acquire to get into doing some more of this type of business. At the same time, you're going to want to make sure your garage staff can handle all the different makes and models. And these days it gets a little bit more complicated because as vehicles have been progressing, so is the technology that's involved with them. So it's not necessarily always as easy as working on one car and another anymore. You have to make sure you have the right scan tools and technology to be able to take care of these fleets when there is an issue. Here's a quick little screenshot of some of the cars that we're using. So if you look at that in the bottom right-hand corner, that's kind of our standard sedan with the C&H Taxi brand. And that's, again, we do most of our work with that. About 5, maybe even 8 years ago, we kind of launched the Eco Ride brand. So in your bottom left-hand corner is our Prius that we put the Eco Ride branding on. And again, we do a lot of the work in that. But if you pay attention to the top two, our brand that we really focus on these days is our Link brand. And so Link, the top right is the SUV. So that's a Ford Explorer that we use. And a lot of fleet owners are probably going to end up going to the Ford Explorer. Ford and lots of these other OEMs or manufacturers have been taking out sedans. So if you are like us and you kind of get secondhand vehicles from fleets, usually it's police fleets. And historically, lately, in the last 5 to 10 years, they've been Ford Tauruses and Ford Explorers. And the Taurus and the Explorer use the same basic platform. So there's a lot of commonalities between the two. But it's my understanding Ford is even going to start phasing out the Taurus. So the Explorer is something that we're kind of really focusing on now. And then in the upper left-hand corner there is our Wave vehicle, or wheelchair accessible vehicle, that we've got several of in the fleet that we utilize to handle some of our medical work. So wheelchair vehicles can be another level of complication and expense. And there's some things that you can do to kind of help out with that. And don't forget, Joe Rubino is one of the consultants that's involved with this overall project, and he's brilliant at this type of stuff. And he helped us get involved with this. So there's a federal program out there, if you don't know it, called 5310. and it's a grant program that can help you acquire a wheelchair accessible vehicle. A lot of times, especially here in West Virginia, you do need a partner that's either a nonprofit or a government organization that can kind of help out with that. They become the direct recipient and you become a sub-recipient. Usually the grant covers about 80% of the cost of the vehicle, and then you have to come up with the other 20%. We've always just provided the other 20% ourselves, but there's other avenues where you could go out and try to find that other 20% from other partners also. There is a lot of paperwork and compliance that gets done with these things. I don't think it's just as easy as acquiring that vehicle. In our scenario, they have special forms that we have to fill out on a daily basis to make sure that the vehicle is in proper order. We have to keep track of certain statistics that they like, and then we have to report to them monthly. So there is a time and paperwork commitment, but again, if you can get some of these vehicles significantly cheaper than paying full price, it can be well worth it. One very important thing that I think you need to kind of consider too when you start doing this work is, do you do it with employees or independent contractors? And I know there's lots of different fleets out there that handle things different ways, and some people have both. It's several times in our operation here, we've had employee drivers and independent contractors. And so you really kind of need to analyze your current market and driver base to kind of figure out what may work for you. So one thing I always recommend is look at wages and fuel versus what your lease price and maybe what your processing fee is to process this voucher work for your drivers. If you're in an area that has low wages, maybe low fuel costs, a pretty good labor force, then employees may make a lot of sense here, especially if you're doing really long or really large trips that could be several $100s. If some of these items are high, if you're in an area where minimum wage is super high and fuel costs are high and the labor force is not the greatest in the world, then and your lease rate is in pretty good shape and your processing rate's in pretty good shape, then you may want to look at using independent contractors, especially if you already have a fleet of independent contractors and you're trying to find work for them to do, because obviously you need to feed them more work so they can pay your lease fee. So if you're in a scenario where you need more work for them, then you can do some of this work or a lot of this work with independent contractors. As a matter of fact, with us, we do most of our NEMT and corporate work with independent contractors. One thing you do need to consider, though, obviously, is the degree of control needed for the work. So there's lots of times where some of this work requires a lot more direction. And so you have to be careful on how you handle that, because you don't want to cross that line between an independent contractor and an employee. So you always want to consider, how much of my direction am I going to need to give the driver? If you tell the driver they have to be here on a certain date at a certain time, and they have to do these trips in a certain order, and they have to dress a certain way, and they have to go in the house, and they have to do this and this and this and this, and that's an employee. And you really need to kind of take a step back and look and probably hire employees to do that work. Now, there are some ways you can kind of work around that. So, a lot of these brokers and corporate organizations that we work with, we basically, they're saying what the rules are. They're saying this is what needs to be done. Here's how you need to do it. We then kind of let our independent contractors know, we have this work available from this customer or this client. If you want to do this work, here's what they say that needs to be done. Here's what you should do. And a lot of times you can kind of just play a good line there and let some of that degree of control come from the client, not from yourself. Again, kind of using independent contractors, a lot of times that was just you releasing a vehicle to somebody for a flat rate, and they would just kind of do street work or dispatch trips. And so with account work, we've talked about this a little bit, it's going to require a lot more billing, a lot more collecting. So you want to consider one or two options here. If you have a flat lease fee, you may want to make that lease fee a little bit higher. Or if you have a processing fee for an account, then maybe you keep your flat lease fee a little bit lower, and then you can have a different processing fee for the type of account work. Again, we generally do between 5 and 10% of a trip for some of that processing stuff. And you want to weigh for yourself which may be more attractive for your driver. So it kind of helps in scenarios. We didn't want to go with just a higher flat lease fee, because there may be some of this corporate work other drivers don't really want to do. And so we wanted to make it so we didn't want to lock everybody into it and say, okay, this is our high flat lease rate. If you don't want to do this work, go do other work. we decided to have processing rates. So if drivers wanted to do some of these trips, they paid that fee through doing that type of work. Now, you can always have the flip side too. If a driver's already paying the higher flat lease fee, then maybe in their mind, they say, okay, I'm already paying this lease fee. I might as well go out and do some of this corporate work. It doesn't cost me anything extra. Might as well try to put some money in my pocket that way. So it's really knowing about what your market is and knowing how your drivers think on the best way to kind of figure out how you're going to derive revenue from this, either leasing or charging a processing fee on the trips. The more you keep getting into this, the more you really need to think about how you're going to market and do business develop here. So you may want to consider a rebranding of sorts. As you kind of saw our pictures earlier, we're kind of, everything we do going forward really focuses on this Link brand. And our idea behind it is, a lot of times corporate entities, especially now that ride sharing has kind of made a lot of this stuff generic, you have to keep in mind, is somebody really going to hire a taxi to do this type of work? Or when they think of limo, are they thinking of stretch limo? Are they really going to hire a limo to do that type of work? So our philosophy over the years has really been to transform into really just a general transportation company that can do any and all type of work. And so we chose a branding route that would kind of get us down that road as well. So you kind of want to keep that in mind as you move forward. Does it make sense to maybe change our brand? And I think you've seen a lot of that really over the last decade with lots of fleets across the country where they call themselves transportation groups, or they've kind of gotten away from specific words such as taxi or limo or just paratransit. All this stuff, you can kind of start out a little bit on the slow end, but as you start nailing down these needed processes, keep adding to it, because once you get the billing in order and your accounts receivable in order and the cars are out there, again, these are all resources you already have in place right now, and we're just taking them to a step further. As you nail that step further down, then you want to keep adding to it. If you know how to handle most Medicaid or Medicare transportation for one broker, you can do it for lots of other brokers. If you're doing it for lots of corporate accounts, you can find other corporate accounts that need transportation. If you're doing crew transportation for one type of entity, look at railroad, barge, or airline, because relatively, once you're in this genre of work, it's all relatively similar. There's going to be some differences here and there, but you already have an investment in drivers, vehicles, dispatching or technology platform, office staff, customer service stuff. You just want to keep adding as much transportation work as you possibly can, whether it's just passengers, whether it's packages, or whatever it may be. Our philosophy has become, we're transporting something from point A to point B. How can we do that more efficiently? How can we do that for everybody? Over the last year with the COVID-19 and the pandemic we had, delivery became a huge thing, right? Especially with restaurants and either other items. And I feel like we personally missed the boat on that. While we did a little bit of it, it wasn't as much as we should have done. And so as we continue forward, that's stuff we're going to continue to focus on. Is we're a transportation company. We want to be able to transport anything and everything from point A to point B. Okay, so one really important thing is to really try to understand these agreements that you have, especially with NEMT work when you're working with brokers. Brokers can be, a lot of times if you're dealing with a large national broker, they can kind of be the gorilla in the room. They want to pay things like unloaded miles or no-show fees or tolls. So act accordingly, or have fees somewhere in place that handle those beyond a certain radius. If they don't want to pay those things, then don't do those work for them, because you're going to get stuck holding an unpaid bill. So if they don't want to pay you unloaded miles to go a far distance, or they're not going to pay you no-show fee or something like that, then don't do that work outside of a certain radius. Just say, okay, we'll handle all these trips here that's not going to require unloaded miles or no-shows, fees, or tolls. Now, you can always have an agreement in place that's either in writing or just says, hey, if we go beyond this, we're going to agree on a different price. So if you want me to go 20, 50, 100, 150, 200 miles outside of a radius, then at that point in time, you and I are going to agree on a price for that trip, or have a formula in place for when that happens. And sometimes it's better to be a bit on the more expensive side and provide better service. You may not get as much volume, but you're better protected. So we've ran into lots of situations, especially with some brokers, where we say, they keep coming to us and saying, you're so much more expensive than everybody else. We can't use you so much. And I say, I understand, but you have to understand, I know what our costs are. And there's no way that I can do something realistically for the cost you want to pay. So, and what always happens is they try to bring somebody else in, and we see a little slump for a period of time, but then that person goes out of business or can't do it because they don't know what they're really talking about. They don't know their numbers, and they don't know their operation, and they don't last long. And over time, that actually ends up being a better relationship between you and the corporate account and the broker, because they know that you're solid and they know that you will probably be there for years to come. And then all of a sudden they start being more willing to work with you on some of these prices. And that's what you want, is you want a good partnership between you, the corporate account, the broker, the passenger, the facility. The more everybody wins in the scenario, the more everybody's happy, and the more it helps your bottom line in the long run. So for the most part, that's about all I have. Feel free to ask any questions. I think we had a couple come in earlier, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions I possibly can.
Yes, thank you so much, Jeb. That was awesome. I definitely have a couple of questions that have floated in, but feel free to utilize the chat box if anybody has any additional questions, and I will get to those as well. But the first one that I have here, do you need to have a wheelchair accessible vehicle for NEMT to work for you and your fleet?
So no, you don't need to have one. A lot of NEMT work can be ambulatory, which means that it doesn't require a wheelchair. So you can do that work with sedans. And the majority of our NEMT work is not in a wheelchair accessible vehicle. But I will tell you this, is that wheelchair accessible vehicles can be a lot more useful. Obviously, there's a ton of work out there, and that can give you a little bit of a competitive advantage or a niche of work that you can do that a lot of other people cannot do. It's one of the things the rideshare industry has always kind of struggled with, is actually going out and doing this type of work with wheelchair accessible vehicles, because they don't own their own vehicles. And so it can be a huge advantage to do that. Don't need it, but it can be a huge advantage and a great moneymaker.
Great. What is the biggest challenge you've had in getting paid from the clients?
So again, it can be very challenging to collect money. You can have some clients or brokers out there that are very strict on the information that they need to pay you. And they'll do that strategically too. And I've seen scenarios where they tell you they want one thing and they almost change it kind of as you move along to keep trying to, basically protect their cash flow or keep it from flowing to you very quickly. So one thing you always want to do is when you start off in the very beginning, make sure you clearly understand how that client wants to be billed, how they want to see that information, how they want it organized, what information they need, and get that right from the very beginning. And then every time they come back to you and say, hey, we've got a misstep here, we can't pay you because your decimal point's in the wrong place, or your margin's not big enough here, you just keep correcting it. If you stay on top of it throughout the whole time, you'll get all those wrinkles ironed out, and your cash flow and billing will be much better.
Great. We got a great question because obviously this presentation might be overwhelming to somebody that's coming into it that might not have this experience. Where does one even start to get this type of work?
So there's a lot of places you can really start, and sometimes it's really going just directly to a hospital in your area and seeing what their transportation needs, or if you know that, like here in West Virginia, we do a lot of railroad work and there's a lot of crew work. So start communicating with maybe some of those organizations or businesses to see what their transportation needs are. Brokers usually are pretty big now in a lot of different states, so you can always reach out. If you know the broker in your area, just reach out to them. Or if it's that kind of done in a partnership with like a DHHR or something like that, you can always reach out to DHHR and see what their transportation needs are. But really, it's about surveying your environment, realizing what the transportation needs are, finding out who those entities are that kind of control that, and then just communicating with them. And sometimes that can take a lot of time. It can take maybe a year or two before you kind of break into some of this stuff, or sometimes it will land on your lap. If you're in an area that just needs that, there's tons of work and the suppliers, the transportation vendors aren't doing a great job, then a lot of times once you kind of get a foot in the door, people start coming to you a lot faster and say, hey, can you help us out here?
Awesome. This is a specific one that came in through the chat during a presentation. You mentioned that you allow Uber and Lyft drivers to lease their vehicles. How do you deal with insurance claims if they get in an accident while in an Uber or Lyft trip?
So our philosophy is they lease the vehicle from us, and we actually provide insurance on that vehicle, just like our normal fleet. So if they're doing taxi work, corporate account work, NEMT work, we cover the insurance on that. To this point, I've never had an accident yet in which the Uber or Lyft driver was doing Uber or Lyft trips in the vehicle. They do those trips, we just happen to have an accident at that time. Now, what I would do at that time, depending on the laws of the state that you're in, and a lot of laws are pretty regular these days, but if the person is using the app and there's an active passenger done properly through the active app, then in the state of West Virginia, the law says that TNC, Transportation Network Company, Uber or Lyft, has to have insurance in place. So we would probably do a little battle there to say, hey, this was an Uber trip. It was done on the Uber platform. It was active. Uber's got the insurance for this trip. We would argue that point.
Great. How do you get your drivers to work outside their comfort zone in order to accommodate different service offerings?
So that's always a challenge, right? Especially when you're working with independent contractors. Employee drivers, you can direct. You can tell them, hey, go do this trip, do this trip, do this trip. With independent contractors, you cannot direct. And they have a lot of freedom to kind of choose the trips or the type of work that they want to do. So then, our job becomes is how do we do that? How do we convince drivers to do this type of work? Well, that can go a lot of different ways. That's one of the reasons why we have a variable processing rate on some of these different voucher forms, as we want to use those rates to kind of help say, some of this work, we're not going to charge you much more for, please help us out with that. Usually that work becomes a lot more prevalent though. So if half your business now becomes corporate work, then those drivers are seeing that corporate work come in. They have fewer choices maybe for retail or street hails or that type of work. So, and sometimes the word gets out too. When they start seeing, all of a sudden they can get a manifest, here's a manifest of all kinds of trips for you. We can give these to you a week out. Then that becomes very appealing. I think one of the things that we've seen with society over the last decade plus is that humans really just want what's easiest and what's convenient. They don't necessarily want to put in a ton of work. So if you can make somebody's life easier for them, then they're maybe more likely to do that. And by providing somebody with a ton of corporate work that's already pre-scheduled, prepaid, then that kind of helps convince a driver to do that versus going out there the old school way, hustling up your own clients, looking for people flagging you down and things of that nature. So just by kind of making that work easier for them and maybe more profitable for them can be a good way to get them to do it.
That's great. And then also, as an early adopter of technology, what do you feel is the return on investment of embracing these tech solutions that open up business opportunities?
So that's a very open-ended question. And the fact that you have to look at which technology you're talking about,
Mm-hmm.
type of work it's going to open up for you. We've always been a huge believer in in-vehicle cameras. I think we were a huge early adopter in that way back in the early 2000s. That those cameras don't actually make you more money, right? They're not really producing more revenue. They may help you get an account because they like the idea that you have this safety feature inside your vehicles, but they actually save you a ton of money because a lot of the cameras these days also have driver behavior analytics. So you're seeing how drivers drive your vehicles. And when you start being interactive with that and saying, okay, these drivers are driving like this, and you can work with the drivers to drive more safely, two things happen. One, you have less wear and tear on your vehicles, so you have less expense in maintaining them. And two, you should have less accidents. And less accidents means less expense in dealing with accidents. When you're looking at dispatch platforms, as I mentioned earlier, you're dealing with lots of complexities these days with all these different variables, and you need to keep all that stuff in order. So if you have a very good platform that fits your needs and is tuned well and is doing everything that you need, then that can help you reduce the number of people you have in the office handling these things. And again, it can save you money that way. We've never been in an environment, I know back in kind of the late 90s in the early 2000s, people would say, hey, put in a dispatch system, it'll save you tons of money on call center people and you'll get tons more trips. That was never going to be the case for us because we are in a relatively small rural area. We were already at kind of our peak of things. So we looked at it more as how can we become more efficient? How can we, maybe save on an employee here or there, but then how can we really expand that forward and take in more complex work like the NEMT and corporate work and keep all that stuff in order that way? And these technology systems do help you with that. Now, you might be in an environment, if you're a larger fleet or if you're in a bigger metropolitan area and you do have tons of call center staff and you do have tons of billing people, you may actually save a ton of money by incorporating some of this technology because it will save you on your call center people, especially if you get some of this automation in place where people can book a cab through an app or the website, or they can use an interactive phone system, or that allows you to cut down on your call center a lot. And if all your billing becomes automated, it helps you cut down on your accounts a lot. There are fleets out there who have automated to the point where they've cut 20 people from their staff out of their office. So that can be a huge expense. Obviously, you'd have to run the ROI numbers on that in the long run. But technology over time generally becomes more efficient and cheaper versus labor. So, there's a whole debate out there in the future, is technology going to take jobs away? And that's a whole nother webinar. But you kind of can start to see there's instances of that happening. So technology that's existing in our industry right now can be a huge help there.
Great. Well, those are all of the questions that I've had. Thank you so much, Jeb. Oh, sorry, there's a dog barking in the background. Thank you so much, Jeb. Do you have any lasting words of wisdom before we conclude our webinar?
I think that's about it. If anybody does have any other questions or has anything they want help with, please feel free to reach out to me directly or the TTA in general, and we'll see what we can do to help you out.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope that everybody has a great day, and thanks for joining us, and have a good one.
All right. Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank you. Bye-bye.